Good evening, this is Mimi Rosenberg. We're going to spend the next hour investigating another aspect of right-wing organizations and the general political environment that they function in. I'm very pleased to have with me Dennis King, who is a freelance investigative writer and what he calls a self-styled cultologist, which he will explain more about. Dennis has done extensive research on the National Caucus Labor Committee, and I'm just going to lay out a little bit about who they are, and Dennis will carry the ball from there. The National Caucus Labor Committee and its political arm, the Labor Committee, has cells in approximately 33 cities, an election machine in more than a dozen cities, a budget of over $2 million a year, and a major computer software firm. In addition, they have a press with a biweekly newspaper, which some people may know is called New Solidarity. They publish magazines and business publications. Here is a group who works with forces as diverse as the Liberty Lobby, the Black Muslim groupings, and various labor officials. They have grown to extensive size and influence on a world scale, and we thought it was important to look at this group. Perhaps you can start by giving us more of a detailed picture of the Labor Party, who Lyndon LaRouche, their leader, is, and how you got involved in doing some of the investigative work around them.
All right, first of all, the group which you call National Caucus Labor Committees is actually National Caucus of Labor Committees. This is the cadre organization within the United States of an international neo-fascist formation, neo-Nazi formation in many respects, called the International Caucus of Labor Committees, which has national organizations in about a dozen countries. Their most powerful group is here in the United States, but they are also well organized in West Germany, and to a lesser extent in Sweden, Italy, France, Mexico, Canada. They claim to have an organization in Colombia and South America. The U.S. Labor Party is the name they're best known as because that is their electoral arm, and they run their candidates for public office as U.S. Labor Party candidates. That is, until last summer, at which time they announced that they were entering the Democratic Party to form a so-called conservative faction there and to run Mr. LaRouche for president in the Democratic primaries. I said last summer, I really meant actually the summer of 1979. So since then, they say that the United States Labor Party has been dissolved into this Democratic party faction, so to speak. However, the National Caucus of Labor Committees, the cadre organization, has not been dissolved, and in fact is every bit as fanatical and tightly organized as it previously was. To my way of thinking, the most dangerous thing about this group is their ability to fool people. Groups like the Klan and the uniformed neo-Nazis, you openly know what they stand for. They wear their sheets or they wear their swastikas and their jackboots. They're upfront about it. The National Caucus of Labor Committees, or the U.S. Labor Party, is covert. They do come out in the open with a great deal of anti-Semitic propaganda. They even make remarks which I interpret as being neo-Nazi, but they generally use a code language for that, in which the Jews are suddenly referred to as the British, and they talk about wiping out the British. But the British always have Jewish surnames, like Rothschild and Oppenheimer and so on. Anyway, they, rather than going out and burning crosses on lawns, they set up front organizations. And these organizations are generally formed around very real issues to which people need solutions. For instance, the energy problem. The National Caucus of Labor Committees for years has been agitating for fusion energy research, for a massive Manhattan project to develop fusion energy. Actually, a very sound idea. They founded something called the Fusion Energy Foundation in order to promote this, and succeeded in fooling many scientists and engineers and nuclear power company executives around the country into giving them support. Largely as a result of the Fusion Energy Foundation's work, over 50 scientists and engineers from all over the country endorsed the U.S. Labor Party candidate, Mr. LaRouche, for President of the United States this past year. I doubt that most of these scientists were fully aware of who or what they were supporting. Some of them probably were. But it was the agitation around the issue of nuclear power and fusion power that enabled this extremist sect to get its hooks into these individuals. Likewise, around the issue of stopping the drug traffic. The U.S. Labor Party and National Caucus of Labor Committees has been able to form alliances with black Muslims for a while, with the Prince Hall Masons, which is a large Masonic order within black communities around the country, with Black American, a weekly newspaper here in New York, with the Chicago Defender, which is the largest black weekly in the country, with various black ministers and state legislatures around the country, and not just with blacks, but also with many whites concerned with the drug traffic, people in law enforcement, people again on the state legislative level, a very distinguished research scientist at Columbia University's College of Physicians and Surgeons. All over the country, there are people who have lined up with the National Caucus of Labor Committees around this issue of stopping the drug traffic and participating in the National Anti-Drug Coalition, which is another U.S. Labor Party front. So through this use of front groups and through their wise choice of issues, that is, issues of wide concern, they have been able to develop a great deal of leverage and political influence that they could not have developed if they were just out burning crosses on the lawn.
Dennis, just to backtrack for a second, I think those of us who first heard of the Labor Committee were familiar with them in their mop-up campaign. Meaning there were vicious physical attacks and verbal attacks on those members of the left, such as the Communist Party USA and so on, whom they considered to be reformist and sellout and all the other catchwords they used. And now we are referring to them as a right organization and a quote-unquote neo-Nazi organization is the term you used. Maybe you can catch people up onto why they made the shift, and are they a right or are they a left group, or is this part of their general chameleon strategy for accomplishing power?
I have no doubt but that they are now what you would call a far right-wing organization. I recognize, however, that they do come out of a left-wing past. Many people find that hard to believe, that people could change so thoroughly. I merely refer you to the example of Benito Mussolini, the late dictator of Italy, who began his career as a left-wing socialist during World War I, and yet he saw an opportunity to gain power by moving in the other direction. He formed the Brown Shirts, and soon he was in power as a fascist dictator and was wiping out all the leftists, or putting them into jail and making alliances with Hitler. So there's definitely a precedent for the sort of transformation that's occurred in the National Caucus of Labor Committees. I think, though, to understand this particular transformation, as opposed to that of Mussolini, you have to understand the leader of the NCLC, one Lyndon Hermile LaRouche, who in the 1960s called himself Lynn Marcus, a name which of course comes from Lenin and Marx. He was originally a member of the Socialist Workers' Party. He was expelled from that organization for being in some faction they didn't like, and over a period of years he decided to form his own group, which came into existence around the time of the Columbia strike in 1968 up on Morningside Heights, where Lynn Marcus, in fact, played a rather influential behind-the-scenes role and was able to recruit some of his early cadre. However, as his organization began to grow, Mr. LaRouche found he was not able to supplant the traditional groups on the left in this country, such as the Communist Party. He became frustrated The first sign of this frustration was Operation Mop-Up, in which his cadre trained in guerrilla tactics and in the use of nunchucks and pistols and knives and so on, and went out and started attacking meetings of the Communist Party and other left-wing groups. And I have been told by people who monitored that period that there were at least 60 instances of violent attacks by the goon squads of Mr. LaRouche. During the same period of frustration, Mr. LaRouche transformed his organization from a traditional far-left sect into a full-blown cult, almost akin to the Moonies, in that it practiced a form of psychotherapy closely akin to brainwashing, that the group became very inward-turned. Mr. LaRouche established really an authoritarian dictatorship over the minds of his members, would not tolerate any dissent whatsoever, began regulating people's lives even down to the most minute detail, including telling people who to sleep with, telling wives to leave their husbands, ordering people to have abortions. He became, it's like the dictator of some little religious commune out in the countryside, or the dictator of some whacked-out Upper West Side therapy cult. It was that type of control that he established over his followers. I think the combination of his own acts of self-isolation on the left, his own frustration, and also the setting up of the cult, all of these things sort of coalesced in order to push Mr. LaRouche toward the right. And over a period from, I would say, 1973 through 1978, a complicated transformation took place, at first very slowly and later by leaps and bounds, to where by 1977 the Washington Post was able to report that Mr. LaRouche was a full-blown right-winger with close ties to the Liberty Lobby, which is a group that's only slightly more moderate than the uniformed neo-Nazis, a group that's very viciously anti-Semitic. And he had also formed alliances with such people as Colonel Tom McCrary, who's a far-right Southerner who was part of the George Wallace movement in Georgia in 1968, and later supported Lester Maddox for president. He formed other alliances on the far right, and he made attempts to get in with Burt Society, but they would have nothing to do with him for whatever reasons. I think in part, I think it was just honestly the Burt Society saw that this man was going too far for them. Because LaRouche is genuinely a totalitarian, and he makes no bones about that. By the fall of '77, the alliance with the Liberty Lobby and other right-wing groups was pretty well coalesced, and he had also hired as his security consultant a former CIA contracting employee and millionaire arms dealer named Mitchell Werbel III, who has a right-wing paramilitary training camp in Georgia. So this was another link-up on the right. And the final stage in the transformation, I would say, came in around January of 1978, where LaRouche came out in the open as an anti-Semite. And suddenly there was just an explosion in the headlines of his newspaper, New Solidarity, of all of these attacks on Zionists and the Rothschilds and of the British and the Jewish bankers in London, and it just went on month after month after month.
Dennis, what is advantageous to LaRouche in picking up on an anti-Semitic line? Most of the groups that we've talked about today are definitely anti-Semitic, the Klan, the Nazis, and so on. Some of the Christian movements, of course, are very reactionary in their treatment of the Jews and so on. But even more in focus is their hatred of blacks and people of color in this country. Why has LaRouche not capitalized on racist sentiment? Why is he drawn on anti-Semitic sentiment, and to what extent is that carried? How important is it really?
Well, I think that Mr. LaRouche has a different analysis of the world from some of the other right-wing groups, and he has a different tactical approach to attempting to unite what he calls a silent majority in this country in order to take power. Mr. LaRouche really believes that that history operates as a conspiracy. And as he has said over and over again, there is an evil oligarchy that's at the heart of the conspiracy to halt human progress and to send us back to the Dark Ages. And the leadership of this conspiracy, as it's been described both by him and his followers, who also write theoretical articles, is apparently this group of Jewish bankers in London. And he traces it back for hundreds of years, and still you find the prominence of Jewish names as being involved in the oligarchical conspiracy. On the other hand, he believes that there is a good conspiracy too, the conspiracy of humanists to overthrow the oligarchs. And the humanists are, by his definition, the International Caucus of Labor Committees and whoever will collaborate with them. And he's found some rather interesting people to whom he says are part of his conspiracy. For instance, the Nico Diederik, the late president of South Africa and the founder of apartheid philosophy in South Africa, and also a Nazi spy during World War II. Professor Diederik was defined a couple of years ago by LaRouche's followers as being a humanist, and is part of the international movement. There's also a couple of German bankers that they have claimed are part of the international humanist movement. I personally think that the word humanism, as they use it, is merely a code for the reemergence of fascism.
One of the things that is peculiar to me, and I'm wondering how you might explain this, is the fact that many Jewish intellectuals have worked, and we will get more into Computron and some of the business aspects of the Labor Party, but why do you think there are actually intellectual Jews who must be aware of this turn towards anti-Semitism and the code words, which is indeed a very fragile cover for what is a blatant genocidal concepts advocated by the Caucus of Labor Committees? What is it that holds them connected to a man like Lyndon LaRouche?
Well, I think first you have to understand that there is a tradition among young Jewish intellectuals, left-wing intellectuals around New York City, to be extremely critical of Jewish culture and of the state of Israel and of the philosophy of Zionism and of Israel's treatment of the Palestinians and so on. Now, I'm not going to comment on, the validity of those criticisms. I'm merely taking note of them. And yes, these criticisms, are so sharp, and often so strongly felt that it's relatively easy for a very clever demagogue to just take people who hold such beliefs and give them a little extra shove over into the camp of anti-Semitism. Now, LaRouche has done it not just through intellectual manipulation, but more importantly through the construction of the cult. If you look, for instance, at Jonestown and the whole experience of the Reverend Jim Jones, if that man could persuade 900 people to commit suicide, many of them voluntarily, although maybe others were forced, nevertheless, if that can be done, then it would seem to me it's a relatively easy task for a cult leader to persuade a bunch of young Jewish intellectuals who are already very sharply critical of their past to take the further step into active anti-Semitism. And of course, Mr. LaRouche's philosophy is not the traditional Hitler one in which all Jews are genetic degenerates who must be wiped out, but rather his philosophy is one that Jewish culture is a criminal culture, and yet individual Jews, if they completely repudiate that culture and go over to his philosophy and become loyal followers of him, then they will be exempt from whatever repression is bestowed on the rest of the Jewish people at a later date. So that's the way it goes. He has a philosophy that makes it possible to recruit Jews. He concentrated on young Jewish intellectuals who already had a predisposition in this direction, and he used cult methods in order to really entrap them into something that was far more extreme than what I think any of them intended to be entrapped in. And to this day, I believe that many of his Jewish followers are not really consciously aware of what they're involved in. I mean, they're so whacked out and they're so bound up in the intellectual intellectual excitement of all of LaRouche's theories about entropy in the universe and thinking like Beethoven and the ancient struggle between Platonic philosophy and Aristotelian philosophy, that they don't see the forest for the trees. They don't see what's the underlying strain of really negative and vicious ethnic hate-mongering behind all of the rarefied intellectual theories. But I wanted to make one other point, and that is, although many of the most visible people in the LaRouche organization are Jewish, and LaRouche encourages them to step forward and be public spokesmen, because after all, that shields him against the charges of anti-Semitism, no matter what he says. Nevertheless, the top levels of his organization are not Jewish by and large. And if you look at the people who really make policy in the International Caucus of Labor Committees, LaRouche himself, who's of French-Canadian and also New England WASP mixed background, his wife Helga Zepp, who's West German, the so-called Greek Mafia, which is a group of young Greek computer executives who form his circle of closest advisors. These people are not Jewish. Dr. Uwe Hinke von Parpart, the most brilliant person in his team, I've been told, and who's recently been touring India and making speeches to scientists and engineers over there. These people are not Jewish, and they're the ones who make the basic policy in the organization. And then there is a second level of leadership who are the Jewish intellectuals and the dupes of all of this.
Dennis, I recall in 1978, reading an article in New Solidarity that was essentially in defense of the CIA, and it was commenting critically on Carter's firing of the Nixonian dirty tricksters. It had been an assumption of mine for a long period of time that this group was a material vision of the CIA, if you will, to attempt initially to discredit the left by having a left posture, which in effect they never really were committed Marxists, etc. What I was wondering is, in your studies, in your investigative work, have you found that they have connections with the CIA, that they are a front group, that they receive monies from this organization, or are they legitimate in the sense that they are what they appear to be upon further study, an independent group that has its own political and economic and governmental desires?
The idea that the U.S. Labor Party is a CIA front originated with the Communist Party's newspaper Daily World back around 1973. The Daily World stated this as if it was a fact. In my opinion, although it was an understandable hypothesis for them to raise, considering that they were the ones being beaten up by LaRouche's people at that time, nevertheless, I do not think that they were ever able to present a credible case. They just didn't have the facts. Here's what I know, that the U.S. Labor Party, starting around 1974, approached both the FBI and the CIA with offers to provide them with information about terrorists. They also approached many red squads around the country, that is, municipal police intelligence organizations, and they approached the state police in New Hampshire. They also had discussions with the state police in California. However, it is one thing for an investigative agency of the government to merely sit and passively receive information from a bunch of lunatics, and it's another thing for them actually to hire these lunatics and give them money to go out and create havoc within people's movements, or to pay them to go out and spy on people and to gather information. I have not seen any hard evidence that the FBI or the CIA has ever given money to the U.S. Labor Party or has ever been particularly enthusiastic about getting information from them. In fact, when they initially approached the CIA told them, if you have something you want to tell us, put it in writing. I have the Freedom of Information documents in which this correspondence went on. In the case of the FBI, being a domestic investigative agency, it was a little more open and did sit down and listen to them. I now understand that there is an Iranian businessman who is suing in Atlanta federal court, I believe, is suing the United States Labor Party for spreading a lot of slanders about him, saying that he was a front for Khomeini's intelligence apparatus in this country. And apparently this information was leaked to the Washington Post through an FBI agent who had been taken in by some of the LaRouche or U.S. Labor Party propaganda that had been given him. But the very fact that it's come out so quickly and is all going to, be laid out in court, I think, as in a way quite embarrassing to the FBI, I think is going to make them more suspicious in the future of LaRouche's offers of help. I'd like to say this also, though. As we all know, back during the Nixon period, and certainly throughout the 1960s, there were a lot of very weird people around the CIA. One of these weird people was Mitchell Werbel, who has been written about in a book called Spooks. There have also been many magazine and newspaper articles about him, and there's no doubt that Mr. Werbel had a long and fruitful and profitable association with the CIA, and he is now serving as a security consultant for the U.S. Labor Party and trains their people at his private farm in Georgia. However, Mr. Werbel did not become associated with the U.S. Labor Party until 1977. And several years before that, he had a falling out with the intelligence community in this country, which has resulted in all kinds of federal attempts to put him in jail. He was arrested for drug smuggling in Florida. He was arrested for arms smuggling. He was arrested for attempting to foment revolutions abroad as a private citizen. I mean, he's been in all kinds of legal trouble in recent years. And the government, at this point, definitely does not like Mr. Werbel. So although he's a former CIA contract employee, to say that he's dealing with the U.S. Labor Party on behalf of the CIA, I don't think is credible. Now, if Reagan is elected as president and Mr. Werbel is brought back into an active association with the CIA, then it might be a different ballgame. But I think for the present that I cannot say that this relationship between the CIA and LaRouche is anything more than LaRouche's own hype. Now, it's true he does allude to or imply that he's had a long-standing relationship with the CIA and the FBI. I think I've talked to people who knew him many years ago, and they simply don't believe it. They believe that this is something he's concocted recently in order to promote his own image on the ultra-right, where there's sort of a cult of, worshiping former intelligence officers. So he wants people to think he's something different from what he really was. He wants to cover up his left-wing past. But this is his media hype. It doesn't necessarily mean that the CIA has ever regarded him as anything more than just another weird guy out there who might possibly be useful on an occasion, but is more a nuisance than anything else.
So far we've used words like cult, and you just said weird guy, which has a tendency to negate possibly the significance of this movement. And one of the things that we're going to try to determine within the next half hour is this a movement to be taken seriously, or is it just a peculiar little fringe cult that we can by and large allow to proceed uninhibited? Perhaps if you can begin by explaining some of their economic and political programs, and then we can move into some of their successes in the electoral arena, we can begin to make that assessment of how important they are for us to observe and to stop in terms of what they're doing.
Okay, well, I think we first should make a distinction between, number one, there is LaRouche, the cult leader, and number two, there is LaRouche, the politician who is aggressively seeking influence and power. We got to make a distinction between those two things, because LaRouche has these two personas and he can switch from one to the other very skillfully. He uses the cult the cult is there as only an instrument of larger aims, and to realize these larger aims, he is making alliances with legitimate people in society who themselves are not cult followers of him and whom he does not aspire to turn into cult followers. In other words, when he deals with somebody like the Teamsters Union, he's dealing with them on a wholly different level. And I think it's highly likely that both they and him know that the cult is nothing but a tool that they're both going to use for mutually agreed upon purposes. Now, as to this business of the CIA pursuing him or seeing him as a weird guy, or the New York Times seeing him as a weird guy, it's true, they do. I think in part it's that they are not aware, certainly, that LaRouche is making inroads, because if people in the Eastern media view him with amusement, people out there in the Middle West, including influential people, are beginning to regard him seriously. And why are they regarding him seriously? Because he has a serious economic and political program he's putting forward, and it is a program for nothing less than the establishment of fascism in this country. He does not call it fascism. He doesn't use that word. He'll tell you that he's anti-fascist. He'll say he's a humanist. But the program is one of constructing a corporative state here. It's one of establishing universal military training, not just the draft, but like everybody in uniform. It's one of regearing our economy for a massive program of what amounts to militarization. It is one of establishing an aggressive foreign policy, of expropriating the usurers on Wall Street, which would be one of his terms for the Jews, expropriate their money. It is one for crushing all forms of liberal and radical thought in this country, and it is a policy of crushing democracy itself. In fact, he stated very bluntly, it was a speech he made when he first started running for president back in the spring of 1979, that he wants to destroy democratic pluralism in this country and establish what amounts to a dictatorship. And he said that on other occasions. There is a document that was put out by his West German organization called Der Rechtsstaat, or the constitutional state, in which they very clearly lay out a philosophy of totalitarian political power to be established in West Germany and by implication in the United States. So, as I see it now, this man has concrete programs to go along with this. He has his program for solving the energy crisis. He has his program for reindustrializing the economy, or rather retooling our industry to make it more competitive. He has a program for dominating the third world through export of our technology. And much of what he says is very, very carefully thought out, very carefully researched, and I would even say brilliant. And I think a lot of people on the fringes of the establishment who have gotten frustrated with the present system and with the decline of American power and influence around the world, they're beginning to look at this man and saying, hey, this guy really has some answers. He really makes sense. And in fact, he does have answers, and he does make sense, because always fascism is an option for a democratic, capitalistic society that's in a process of decline. And Mr. LaRouche is currently, to my knowledge, the only serious economist, philosopher, and political thinker who's addressing the problem of how do you bring about fascism in this country, and what will it be like. Now, if there's people who are beginning to think in that direction, and there's a theoretical vacuum, because and there's only one man who comes in to fill that vacuum, then inevitably the people thinking in that direction are going to gravitate to that man's thought. They have to, because he's the only game in town.
Doesn't this, in effect, though, negate the objective conditions that we've seen bring on fascism in other countries? There were certain conditions that predominated in Germany. It's interesting to note why the working class there did not move in a socialist direction. Certainly in Chile, the crushing of a strong left-wing force made necessary a fascist movement, not only to consolidate finance capital, but as a method of social control. And here it's always seemed to me that if fascism was ushered in, it would be on the back of racism, which is its cornerstone. Do you really see the kind of consciousness and the kind of history and economic conditions in this country and the kind of stance of the military, etc., as creating the kind of milieu which a Lyndon LaRouche could thrive in and, in effect, move into some sort of position of power?
I don't see fascism as being around the corner in this country today. No. I think, however, that there is the basis for a fascist movement in this country of significant proportions, and we already see the rumblings of it in the growth of the Klan, in the amazingly high vote that a Nazi candidate got in North Carolina recently, and then a Klan candidate in San Diego, and then another Klan candidate in Michigan, and all three of them, I might point out, were learning from LaRouche and were running in major party primaries rather than running little independent candidacies. Now, whether or not such a movement, if it emerges, could really threaten the foundations of our society depends upon, forces in the world economy and in the whole social development of this country over the next 20, 30 years that I can't, that I'm not competent to predict. All I can say is it's a possibility. It is more than a possibility that a significant fascist movement can grow. I'd say that is probably a likelihood. Not a movement to take power, but a movement that can make a lot of trouble. And Mr. LaRouche is definitely out there as the tactically most sophisticated and the intellectually most brilliant and the best organized of all of the right-wing leaders. And although he makes a lot of mistakes and he does things that, he trips himself up sometimes, well, Hitler also made a lot of mistakes. I don't think that Mr. LaRouche can be taken lightly. I think that we have to see him as a very dangerous demagogue. And if there's even the slightest chance that, he can pull it off in the sense of emerging from quarantine and building a significant mass movement, building a significant coalition of forces such as conservative labor leaders, anti-Semitic black nationalists, farmers, and all the other groups of nuclear power, pro-nuke freaks, all the other people that he's appealing to. If there's a chance he can build this coalition, then I'd say we have to go all out to expose him and unmask him to his potential followers for what he really is, and try and keep that movement as small as possible.
Before, when we spoke about the connection between the CIA, one of the reasons I think the left always had the assumption that they were connected was because there were sums of money that were available that were rather phenomenal. Most progressive organizations just barely scrape through on contributions from their membership. Now, here is an organization that, through its Computron, its computer software firm, does business with Mobil Oil, Colgate, Palmolive, AT&T, Bristol Myers, Weight Watchers International, etc. It's rather staggering. Two of my questions are, one, why in the world would these firms deal with such a reactionary organization? Don't they have something to risk? And two, how extensive is this Computron organization? How extensive are the economic holdings of the Labor Party?
Well, first of all, if you go back to the early 1970s, the vast sums of money that the U.S. Labor Party was allegedly spending then really weren't all that vast. And I think the money can be explained in terms of them getting a hold of the trust funds of wealthy members of the cult, of raising money out on the street, of everybody in the group taking out loans so they could have a little deficit finance operation going. It was only really in the past, since about 1976, that they've really been raising larger sums. I think that a lot of it is their sense of business enterprise. They've embraced capitalism. They happen to be very, very bright, many of his followers, very, very well educated, and so they've gone into business and have found ways of raising money. And when they went into the Democratic Party primary campaign, they very cleverly started a fundraising program. They were able to get from Mr. LaRouche $1.4 million in individual donations. And they were able also to get over $500,000 in matching funds from the Federal Election Commission. but this was their own initiative through which they did this. They really went out and convinced people to give them the money. And then they really went and qualified for the Federal Election Commission funds through getting the requisite amounts of money from the requisite number of donors from the requisite number of states. The FEC couldn't get out of giving them the money. As to the business enterprises, they have a typesetting firm. They have 2 printing businesses. They have an international press service, which is really the U.S. Labor Party's intelligence staff. But they do sell intelligence reports. They sold one to the Shah of Iran and to various other people like that in years past. However, the main business they have going for them is this Computron Technologies Corporation, a computer software company which made $5 million last year, and which, and from every report, is growing steadily so that it will make considerably more this year. Now, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal just a couple of days ago pointing out that software has become really the cutting edge of the whole computer business in this country. And the software industry is growing at a rate twice as fast as the hardware industry. Now, of course, a lot of the software is done within the hardware companies on their own premises by their own people, but nevertheless an independent software vendor can do very well in these boom conditions. Maybe you should just tell people what
software is.
Software is the program that goes into the computer. Hardware is the computer itself. I think that's enough for our purposes here. Computron Technologies Corporation, back in the early 70s, began to form connections with hardware companies who needed software firms to go out and sell their products for them and sell software along with it, because the hardware companies didn't have the capabilities of designing certain types of software. The U.S. Labor Party, was natural for them to go in for this because, number one, they had a lot of people with mathematical and scientific training in their ranks, and number two, LaRouche himself had been a computer executive back in the 1950s and early 60s. In fact, according to one CIA report, he may have been a IBM executive at one point. At any rate, they set up this company, and they made the right connections, and they got themselves a few contracts, and they did good work, and they began to get in with some really big corporations. From every account, they are very good at what they do. Nobody has any complaints about the professional quality of the work. It's one of the better software houses in the New York City area, and it has been expanding. They've gotten into the Arab countries a little bit. They've gotten into other parts of the Near East. I think they have an office in Greece now. They expanded from New York out into New Jersey. They have an office in Caucus. They have an office in Washington, D.C. It's a growing firm. And it tends to keep people in the cult, because a lot of these people who are sort of maybe losing a little of their political enthusiasm figure if they hang in there, then they're going to be, say, a Computron sales manager in Dallas 5 years from now with an income of $70,000, $80,000 a year. So, they are less likely to defect. But I think that the emergence of Computron was merely another example of their cleverness. They looked around and they said, what are our resources? Hey, we don't have a lot of capital, but software business, you don't need capital. You don't need a lot of physical assets to begin with. All you need is talented people. We got the talented people. Let's go into the software business. They did it, and they made a success of it. And that's the great mystery of the funding. I have no doubt that probably a couple of crazy Dallas businessmen have given them $50,000, $100,000 here or there, but I don't really think that is. I don't think that that's a major part of their financing. The mystery is essentially not a mystery. There's nothing especially sinister about it, except insofar as big corporations and also small corporations who know who these people are still continue to do business with them. And you can say, well, this shows that the big corporations are pro-fascist. Like Hustler magazine had an article the other day in which they misquoted me to that effect, as if I believe that the big corporations are knowingly backing LaRouche. In fact, I merely think it's business. Business tends to be apathetic about politics. Therefore, this company comes along, they offer a good deal, the corporations do business with them. Once they do business with them, get to know them, they continue to do business with them. They know they do good work. They read something in the Times that these people are Nazis. What does Bristol Myers care if they're Nazis, as long as they're doing their work? And you see also, LaRouche has all kinds, his company has all kinds of little contracts in the garment center. So you're going to go down there and say that all the little Jewish garment bosses who deal with Computron are also Nazis or supporting Nazis? No, it's just business. And to get the business community to take seriously the question of cutting off Computron from the source of profits, I think would require some real reorientation of people's thinking. And they're not going to do it as long as they regard LaRouche as just some kind of bizarre little cult. I mean, what do they care, I really think that's how they see it.
We started to touch on the area of international connections by mentioning the desire to put together their own intelligence reports, their own intelligence organization, if you will, their international connections through Computron offices abroad. How far-reaching are their international connections? Do they relate to countries like South Africa in anything other than an ideological sense? Are there actually business dealings? Are these other kinds of things that we should be concerned about because they help shape a kind of political perspective that is inevitably going to affect our lives?
I believe that their intelligence operation, their international intelligence news service, as they call it, essentially operates wherever there's a U.S. Or rather International Caucus of Labor Committee cadre. Any city in this country, they make reports every day by telex to the New York headquarters on West 58th Street, telling them what's going on in their region. Likewise, by telex, they will send reports from Europe and various cities in Europe where they have operations. They also have a very large staff who read the entire international press, and they do a very good job of reading it. I mean, after all, even most medium-sized countries, I'll bet you, don't have an intelligence service which really sits down and reads all of the world's press. I'm sure the CIA and the KGB does, but smaller countries probably don't. The U.S. Labor Party does, though. They read everything. And it's amazing the breadth and depth of knowledge that they have about a wide variety of subjects. They have dossiers on vast number of individuals in this country, not only radicals, but people in the establishment and even people on the right like themselves, because they have people who work at it all day long. They have computers, they have clipping files, they have people who speak over a dozen languages. I mean, they can find information. They have Watts lines, a whole bank of Watts lines in their headquarters. People just sit on the phone all day long making undercover phone calls all over the country asking for information. And I've seen some of the reports they compile, sometimes talking to people under false pretenses and other times talking to them openly as the New Solidarity International Press Service. They talk to an amazing number of people and get an amazing amount of information. I mean, for instance, William Colby talked to them after he retired from the CIA. They had a conversation with him. I'm told they also had a conversation with Richard Helms. I know they had a conversation with the former CIA counterintelligence chief, James Angleton, because he told me he had talked to them. Now, a lot of this is they call these people up and, ask them questions. But anytime you talk to somebody on the phone, you can find something out. They just talk to everybody. They used to call me all the time, ask me what I thought of this, that, or the other.
But is it more significant than individual phone calls? Is there a plan? Are they building relationships with countries like South Africa? Or is it something more insidious than the individual seeking out, for whatever their purposes may be, of information about individuals?
There is that too, yes. They have prepared intelligence reports, which I had people from the South African Embassy and in Washington, the South African Consulate here in New York, admit to me, yes, these people submitted, these documents to us. And, they did not say they paid for the documents. The New York Times claimed that they did, that it was a commercial exchange of intelligence. They are now openly admitting that they prepared intelligence documents for the Shah of Iran. And in New Solidarity, their paper announced just the other day that there had been an interview in a West German paper where the Empress, the Empress of Iran, the wife of the late Shah, said that Executive Intelligence Review, that is their business publication, is really the only people who understood how the Shah was overthrown. And then she showed the interviewer a copy of intelligence report that had been prepared. Now, I don't know, if that's completely true or not, but it is confirmation from U.S. Labor Party sources that the New York Times was not making things up when they spoke of intelligence reports for the Shah's Savak. Such reports were drawn up and delivered. Now, then, there's South Africa, there's Iran. They've been, according to their former counterintelligence chief who defected, they did a little intelligence gathering operation for the government of Iraq several years ago. There have been rumors that they've done intelligence gathering for French intelligence, and certainly they have a lot of ties with significant right-wing forces in France. They've done intelligence gathering allegedly for Libya. I've heard that from one person. That may not be true. They met with a official of the Soviet mission to the UN here in New York, who's said to be a KGB agent. Met with him regularly for a while as to whether or not that involved any actual deliverance of information to him. I wouldn't know. I mean, the U.S. Labor Party is strange in that they'll reach out to anybody. If it's the Soviet Union, they'll deal with them. If it's the South Africans, they'll deal with them. Because they think that within every country, regardless of where it is on the political spectrum, there is the same split between the humanists and the oligarchs. And they believe that there's a group in the Soviet Union that's Jewish-dominated, and there's a group in the Soviet Union that can be won to a humanist outlook. Therefore, they want to strengthen the humanist group in the Soviet Union and weaken the British or Jewish faction there. Same thing in South Africa, same thing in this country, same thing in France. Wherever they're reaching out, it's to strengthen the anti-Semitic forces. And since anti-Semitic forces are found within intelligence agencies all over the world, then naturally they want to work with intelligence agencies or with certain elements within those intelligence agencies.
Well, I, for one, have been sadly awoken by some of the things that you've said today. Here is an organization that has paramilitary training, has international connections, has significant amounts of capital behind it, has in some ways legitimized itself in the electoral arena, and yet maintains a paramilitary facility, an international intelligence gathering agency, and advocates totalitarianism. Those are certainly frightening ingredients, and to me are some of the characteristics of a fascistic organization. In the couple of remaining moments that we have, Dennis, how can people find out more in terms of the writing that you're going to continue to do about an organization such as this, and what are some of your recommendations about where we go with this kind of information?
People want to read my articles, they could write me, Dennis King, at 420 East 64th Street, apartment 8G, that's New York 10021.
Dennis, I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time and for informing us about the National Caucus of Labor Committees and the activities of Lyndon LaRouche. This has been Mimi Rosenberg, and Dennis King is a self-styled cultologist, as he said, and an excellent freelance writer. And I certainly hope that your research continues. And again, Dennis King, thank you for being with us.